Good evening. And so as to get into this subject of the illumined consciousness, let me give you this question. Just as a drop of water, though separate from the ocean, has the properties of the ocean, but when it is put back in the ocean, becomes merged in it, the drop no longer has its own identity, so with water, ice, and so forth. Now then, our identity is surely lost as we return to God. And the answer to that is no. You have used too good a reasoning power. And the things of God are foolishness with man. And reasoning power is fine up to a certain point, but do not try to carry it out to an extreme. There is no analogy between matter and spirit, even though here and there you may use comparisons, parallels, analogies for points of illustration, but they must in no wise be considered as absolute. Now the reason that none of this applies to identity is this: that there is no way to explain how it is that God can be one and yet infinite individuality. We know that it is so. For instance, we do know that roses are always roses, apples are always apples, peaches are always peaches, and we also know that each one of us is so individual that even physically our fingerprints or footprints are entirely different, each from the other. And that so far as they know, there are no duplicates. So it is that God, maintaining oneness, yet maintaining infinite individuality. And let us see one concrete example of that. Every individual on the face of the globe has life. But they don't have 50% of life, or 1%, or 1/4 billionth percent. Each individual has the full and complete life, but there are 4 billion people, and each one has full and complete life. Life is not divided up into 4 billion. As a matter of fact, if, when there were only 1 billion people on earth, if life was dividing itself, that billion must have had far more life than we have now that there are 4 billion. But you see, the mere fact that the population has quadrupled doesn't mean that any one of us has lost our life or any part of our life. We still have our full and complete life. How much love can we express? How much integrity can we express? And in how many different ways can we express love, benevolence, charity, kindness, cooperation, justice, mercy? There are infinite ways to express life, infinite ways of expressing love, infinite ways of expressing integrity, infinite ways of expressing morality, and yet each person on the face of the globe can be 100% honest, or 100% moral, or 100% alive, or 100% loving. And how can you explain that? And as far as I'm concerned, you can't. God is infinite one, and yet God is infinite one in all of its individualization. So it is that as you pass from one life to another, or one incarnation to another, you still retain your identity. And when you attain a state of meditation, which is a full and complete realization of God, it probably won't happen many times in any one individual's life, but when it does, you still are yourself. You still have your identity. There is no such thing as being merged into God and losing your identity. You can merge into God and be as individual as you are now. Otherwise, God would not be infinite. God would be one in the limited sense of number one. But God is not limited to any such thing as one. The one which is God is an infinite one. And I'm frank to tell you that you cannot understand that with your mind. You have to go beyond the mind to understand spiritual truth. And that is one way in which we know that mind is not God. Because as long as you are on the level of mind, you cannot come into the awareness of spiritual truth, nor can you ever demonstrate spiritual truth mentally. Now, those of you who have had any instruction from me privately in healing will remember that I have said this to you. There is no thought that you can think that will ever heal anybody of anything. Thought is not power. Oh, it may be power on the human level. Oh, yes, you can train your thought and begin to control people. You can train your thought and learn about propaganda, and you can control whole nations. You can win elections and be prime minister or president just by the power of control, mental control, that you can have over a whole nation on the human plane. But spiritually, thought has absolutely no power. Who, by taking thought, can add a cubit to his stature? Who, by taking thought, can make a white hair black? And if you cannot do the least of these things by taking thought, how do you ever expect to accomplish the greater things? Therefore, thought has no place in our treatment work except as a preliminary which helps us to get established. Now, I will explain that to you so that there will be no doubt in your mind about the healing principle of the infinite way. Let us assume that someone has, well, it could be someone, it could be a dozen someone who have telephoned that they have got the flu. It's fall and the flu season's on, and they have got the flu. Now, as a practitioner, it is most likely that you would close your eyes, turn your thought to God, and immediately realize that this whole claim, whether it was one person or a dozen or 1,000, that this whole claim had its basis in infection, a law of infection, or a law of weather, law of climate. And then you would realize, no, since God is the lawgiver, all law is spiritual, and therefore such a thing as a material law or mental law is completely without power. There could be no power in infection or contagion if all power is in God. Now, that might be your preliminary thoughts, And then you would settle down into your treatment, which would be without thought. Now you take the attitude, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth, and then you wait in silence. You have a listening attitude. Inside of you, you have both ears wide open, as if you were waiting for the still small voice, or as if you were waiting to hear God speak. And sometimes you will hear God speak. Other times you will just have a sense of release or relief or freedom. In a similar circumstance one time, when I had 35 cases of grippe or flu, and closed my doors, went into meditation, and the voice spoke to me very clearly and said, you only have one case. And that is a belief in God and somebody else. A belief in God and another power. And that's all you're dealing with is that belief. And that ended the treatment, because if you're only dealing with a belief in a power apart from God, it's all right, because a belief can't do anything to anybody. And there is no other power than the power of God. And by that night or the next morning, every one of the 35 reported in as healed. Now, no one of them received a treatment personally or individually, because it wasn't they who had an illness. It was a universal belief in, first of all, a person apart from God, and secondly, in a power apart from God. And as soon as that belief is met in the mind of the practitioner, one with God is a majority. And therefore, all those who have tuned in by asking for help, they receive their treatment. And if you want to know why all the rest of the city didn't get healed, it was because they held themselves mentally out here. They were looking at a pillbox. They were looking at an injection. They were looking out here for their help. They had not tuned in to truth. So it is. The thoughts we think in the preliminary stages of our treatment, this is not the power. This is merely to lift us up into an altitude of awareness, into an atmosphere of awareness, of listening for that voice, or for an assurance from God. And that constitutes our treatment. And you'll see why later when we come to the subject of, or deeper into the subject of, illumined consciousness. So it is. God is one, but since God is infinite, God is an infinite one, or an infinity of one, an infinity of one complete being. And each one of us is that full and complete one being. Mathematically, that can't be. Humanly, that can't be. Spiritually, it is true, I am you. And that I is God. That I is my identity. But that I is your identity. And there can be only one selfhood, and that's God. God is the self of you. You will find this in the chapter in Practicing the Presence. Oneness. What is the rest of it? Love thy neighbor. Thank you. Love thy neighbor. It is the chapter, Love thy neighbor, in Practicing the Presence, and in the art of spiritual healing. Oneness. Oneness. Relationship of oneness. That is it. Relationship of oneness in the art of spiritual healing. And that is the only place, or rather those are the only two places in which this subject is completely covered, because both of those came through right from the soul of me, the heart of me, whatever it is that you call God, and therefore it is more clearly stated than anywhere else in the writings. And I think very clearly stated, because I have used those two chapters with students and given them to students to use in all cases of human relationships, whether relationships in their family, among their friends, capital and labor, business, offices, wherever human relationship comes in. If you will work with those two chapters, you will find how much harmony you can bring into the subject of relationship. And the reason is that ultimately, even though you can't explain it any more than I can, ultimately you will see or realize that I is the only God, and God is the only I, and that I is me and I is you. You will witness that worked out in demonstrable experience with cats and dogs and little children. The moment that you sit down to meditate, the moment you begin to feel a oneness with God, if there are any cats or dogs or birds around you, you will see how quickly they will settle down into peace right by your side. And little children will do the same, because your oneness with God establishes the realization of your oneness with them. And because they're not adults with a mind of their own to fight it, they come into that relationship quickly and beautifully. Now, we go further in this question. Would you kindly explain something of the spiritual consciousness being under grace? Give a few instances of what this implies. Indeed, I will, because this is the major theme of all mystical teaching, and it is the theme that really is the foundation of all infinite way teaching, just as the principle of healing has to do with two things: impersonalization and nothingization. In other words, let's go back to healing for a minute, because here is where infinite way healing differs from every form of metaphysical teaching that is taught upon the earth. Infinite way healing principle differs from any and every metaphysical teaching in this: number one, impersonalization. There is no error in you to be uncovered, and never has been. There is no cause of disease in you for which you are responsible. Whether you are resentful or whether you hate your mother-in-law, it is not a cause of disease. And whether you have a Roman Catholic neighbor or an Oriental one or a Jewish one, it isn't going to cause you any disease or wreck your business. Because all evil, regardless of its name or nature, is absolutely impersonal, and it doesn't belong to any person or any animal. It is an activity of what we call the carnal mind or mortal mind, meaning, not a mind, meaning a universal belief in two powers. The universal belief in two powers we call the carnal mind, or temporal power, or the arm of flesh, or nothingness. So that the very moment that someone asks you for help, even if you know they're alcoholic, or even if you know they're a drug addict, even if you know they're living in adultery, please pay no attention to those things. And above all things, don't hold them in judgment or criticism or condemnation, for they are in no wise responsible, nor are those things responsible for their diseases. The disease is a product of a universal belief in two powers, and it is always impersonal and has nothing whatsoever to do with your patient. Therefore, leave your patient out of any responsibility. Therefore, never say to them, you should be more loving, or you should be more grateful, or you should read 12 pages of my book. Don't do that, because then you are giving them a condition and a remedy. And in this work we have no conditions, and we need no remedies. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free of any belief in two powers. So it is then that as you realize the impersonal nature of all evil, and then knowing that what is impersonal has no person in whom, on whom, through whom to operate, you should be doing some good healing work. Impersonalize evil, then nothingize it, in the realization that that which is not of God has no power. If you are dealing with a belief in two powers, and surely God didn't make two powers, one to destroy another, then two powers has no ordination or law. If it is true that life eternal is the measure of our life, if it is true that God is too pure to behold iniquity, if it is true that the Master revealed that evil is not a power, then we are safe in realizing that that which is not ordained of God is not power, and any law that is not ordained of God is not a law. And so material laws, health laws, mental laws, these are not laws. These are products of a universal belief in two powers. Now, the reason that it is difficult to understand this so clearly that you can work with it, the reason that it takes quite a long time before one can really engage in this practice, is this. Every phase of your life that you lived before you found the infinite way was based on two powers, and you've got that all the way back in your theological life for as many thousand years as there has been a theology. In other words, all the way back to where there was a God and a devil, there were two powers. And even with metaphysics, there has been an immortal mind and a mortal mind. And in philosophy, there has always been a good with a capital G and an evil with a capital E. In other words, theologically, philosophically, materially, mentally, medically, the entire world of man is based on a belief in two powers. And that is so much a part of your makeup and mine that I just wonder if we ever are going to rise to that place where we are completely convinced that God is infinite, and because God is infinite, there can be no other power. But to whatever degree we achieve that or attain that, to that degree will we heal. And some of our lack of healings is based on the very thing that we haven't risen far enough above this universal belief that there are two powers. We haven't risen high enough in our realization of God as the substance of life. And then, of course, there is one other mistake, and that only will be corrected in your understanding of the infinite way. I doubt that you'll find it anywhere else. And that is, there is no power for good or for evil that can operate upon you. There is no power either for good or for evil that can operate upon you. And why? Because I have been given God-given jurisdiction over everything that exists, in the world, above the world, beneath the world. Therefore, whatever power there is spiritual power, and that power has been given to me and is flowing out from me. Nowhere in your ancestry will you find anything that will separate you from the belief that there is a God power that could act upon you if you can just find out how, and that there is an evil power that does operate on you without you knowing how. But all of that is based on the belief, first in two powers, and secondly upon the belief that there is a God separate and apart from you. God constitutes your being. God is your life. God is your mind. God is your soul. And even your body is the temple of God. And therefore, I and the Father are one. And all God power then must flow out upon this universe from the I that I am. But just so that you don't worship Joel, I will tell you that that I is your identity. And you will be able to watch this same work take place in the world. You will watch this truth govern your life as you have witnessed it govern mine. When you begin to realize I is God, closer to me than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, I the Father, I the Son. God the Father, God the Son, thou seest me, thou seest the Father that sent me, for I and the Father are one. And because I and the Father are one, all of God's power has been given unto me. Therefore, the power flows out upon this universe from each one of us. All of the conditions of the world today, all of these evil conditions about which you read, could be settled by a group of people no larger than we are in this room. If we could realize whether we're thinking of the whites in Africa that are troublemakers, or the blacks in Africa that are troublemakers, or whether we're thinking of the Khrushchevs, or whether we're thinking of anybody else, if only we could remember thou couldst have no power. Thou, mortal mind, thou, mad ambition, lust, greed, thou art mortal mind or carnal mind, temporal power, nothingness. But we have the Lord God Almighty. And because we have it, it is flowing out from us and it is changing the history of the world. The history of the world isn't changed insofar as its civilization development is concerned by humans, because humans are living under a law which says self-preservation is the first law of nature. And under that law, each one is fighting for himself, dying for himself, saving for himself, working for himself. And that makes 4 billion people, each one pulling apart from each other because of the consideration only of themselves. But every spiritually minded individual is overcoming the power and the presence of all that belief in self-preservation. And that is why when our wizard of General Electric, before he passed on, was asked by a reporter, what do you think will be the greatest discovery in the 20th century? And he said, the greatest discovery will be the discovery of spiritual power. And Cabot Lodge says the other day, the day is coming when we will settle all of our problems by spiritual means. And so it is that, and Mr. Jung, Dr. Jung, said that every case of an adult over 35 that he has seen healed has been healed through a return to a religious principle, not a church teaching, but a basic religious principle, an original religious principle. And so you will find that we are living now in an age when there are enough spiritually illumined individuals to change the history of the world, even while it goes through a period of upset, transition, change. But none of this can be brought about by those who are praying to God to do something for this world, because they are losing track of the only place God is, within you, within me. And they are losing sight of the fact that you don't have to tell God what to do. God is the all-knowing intelligence of this universe. And it is God's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. But find God first. Then relax. Relax in the realization we have the Lord God Almighty in the midst of us, and then rest and let it perform its function. Now, we are in spiritual darkness if we believe there is a God. We are in spiritual darkness if we believe that prayer is going to get God to do something for us individually, for our patients or students, or for this world. We are in spiritual darkness if we are still trying to tell God how to run his universe. We are in spiritual darkness if we think that God is so personal that we can direct him to a person out here or a country. We are in spiritual darkness until we know him aright. Whom to know aright is life eternal. If you want life eternal, you must know him aright, and you will never know him aright until you know that I am him. Until you know this, and until you are able then to rest and relax, don't tell I what to do. Don't direct it where to go. Don't be like that minister who, before the first summit conference, went on radio and prayed to God, telling him what qualities Mr. Eisenhower lacked and what qualities the British Prime Minister lacked and what qualities Mr. Khrushchev lacked, and then prayed that God supply them to them. Isn't it nice that he knew more about all this than God? And isn't it terrible that God didn't listen to him? We would have had a perfect summit conference. But God doesn't pay attention to mortals. Never forget that. God does not pay attention to mortals. If God paid attention to mortals, there'd be no slaughter on battlefronts. There'd be no rape. There'd be no seduction if God were listening to mortals. There'd be no little children run over by automobiles if God were listening to mortals. All of that is a return to paganism. Spiritual enlightenment, that's our subject. Spiritual enlightenment comes when you know God aright. And you know God aright when you know that I am is God. The I am which you are. The I am which I am. And then, when you stop trying to tell I am and direct it and relax in it. Relax, be still and know that I am God. Now what more do you want beside that? You have God in the midst of you. You have in the midst of you the all-knowing intelligence of this universe that knows your need. You have in the midst of you the Father whose good pleasure it is to give you the kingdom. What more do you want than to know that and sit down and relax and rest in it? Let the mind be still. Let all the earth be still. Then you'll see God at work. Now, when you have your first taste of spiritual illumination, which means when you realize that I am closer to you than breathing and nearer than hands and feet, and because the nature of I is infinite intelligence and divine love, and you now sit back and rest. Thank you, Father. I need not live by might or by power, but just by thy Spirit. Thy grace is my sufficiency in all things. Just let me rest in that. Let me commune inwardly with thee. Let me feel thy presence. Let me be aware that thou art closer than breathing. Let me be aware that I cannot flee from thy presence. Not up in heaven, not in hell, not in the valley of the shadow of death. Neither life nor death can separate me from God. Just let me relax in that and then trust God. And I could take you back to an experience during the war when you had here in England a great scientist in charge of one of the nuclear fission projects, and who one day called all of the scientists into a room to have a serious discussion with them and tell them that he was now ready to carry them into the next phase of their work. But he said, I recognize that I will have a difficult time because I presume there are some Christians among you. And we can't take this step as long as you believe in a God, for there is no God. And so I'm going to be free and tell you now that we have proved in the laboratory there is no God. And in order for you to take this next step in our experiments, you must accept the fact that there is no God. Because without that, you can't take this next step. Well, you can imagine the surprise in that room. But the learned doctor went on, we have discovered that there is no God. All there is hydrogen. Hydrogen is the substance of all form. Everything is composed of hydrogen. Without hydrogen, there would be nothing. With hydrogen, there is everything. So hydrogen is really the cause of everything. Well, one of these men spoke up then and said, Doctor, that is most interesting, and of course it'll be complete when you tell us what made hydrogen and what maintains and sustains it. Oh, he said, hydrogen is self-created, self-maintained, and self-sustained. And this man says, we call that God. Now, see how foolish it is when you begin to find a God out here. When you begin to find anything out here to be God, even God. In other words, do you not see that anything that you can conceive with your mind can only be a concept and it can't ever be God? Don't you know that as long as you can say God is love, you're wrong? Love is a quality of God, a facet, an activity. As long as you could say God is mind, you must be wrong. Because all you're doing is describing something that has form or effect that is separate and apart from the you that is announcing it. Do you not see that any concept of God that you have cannot be correct because it's a concept, and a concept can't be God? How can a concept be causative even if you spell it with G-O-D? Now, when you get through saying God is love, God is mind, God is spirit, God is this, God is that, and you train yourself to know that anything that I think must be less than I the thinker. Therefore, I at all times must be greater than anything I can think, even God. And you'll understand why in your book of English mysticism, one great man wrote, "Before God was, I am." You'll know that that's true then. You'll know that the only word that isn't an effect, the only word that isn't a concept, the only word that you can't visualize or picture or imagine is the word I. You can't even know what you're saying when you say I am. And so you're fulfilling Lao Tzu, who says if you can name it, it isn't that. It's true. If you can name it, it's finite. If you can name it, it's external. If you can name it, here it is out here, but it doesn't include me. But to be God, it has to include me too. And the only thing that includes me is I. And so when you say I, you are including me. When I say I am including you. But remember, if I call you John or Bill or Mary, I am finitizing you. Now somebody says, what is John like? And someone says, the finest fellow in the world. The other says, I don't know how you can say that. I can tell you some terrible things about him. Is it true? May be partly true. Can't be true at all because it represents somebody's idea of what John is. Therefore, it isn't John. Now try to see this. Spiritual illumination consists of knowing God aright. And you will never know God aright while you give God a name, an identity, a form. That is why really the Hebrews were forbidden to make any graven images. Don't make anything at all to symbolize God, because in your mind you must keep yourself absolutely free of any concept. And when you have no concept at all, you will find that God has become your life, your being, your health, your supply. There is no God and supply. There is no God and health. And all this praying to God for these things is just stupid paganism. God is infinite, and therefore God is health. God is infinite, therefore God is meat, wine, and water. And the Master said it in plain English, I am bread, meat, wine, and water. And I am it. But only when you have no mental concepts. Somewhere, I think it's in the last chapter of Living the Infinite Way, you will find this whole secret. God is life, but not when you say it. Truth is only true when you are saying nothing and receiving an inner grace. Now, that brings us to the subject of grace. The moment that you know that I is God, you are living under grace. And then you can say, thy grace is my sufficiency, because I do not have to take thought anymore for what I shall eat or what I shall drink or wherewithal I shall be clothed. I do not have to take thought for safety or for security. I do not have to take thought for life or for death. I do not have to take thought for anything. Why should I if I is God? Be still and know that I am God, and go out and live. And you'll find you are living by grace, because the I that I am becomes the food that you eat, the clothing you wear, the health of your body. The I that I am provides, is the opportunity in every direction. And then is the only time when you will really know that age is another nonsensical belief which we have accepted through accepting two powers. Because in God there are not two powers. There is only the power of being self-creative, self-maintaining, and self-sustaining. And if God is my life, it does it all by itself without me taking thought. And that is living by grace. We had a class here last year, I think it was in Manchester, on the unconditioned mind. And I can assure you that when your mind is unconditioned, that you are standing in the very presence of God. That means when you have no finite concepts, when you are willing to erase from your mind whatever it is that you believed about God, or whatever you believed about spiritual creation, or whatever you believed about anything else on the face of this globe. Erase it all from your mind and be taught of God, because you've got God closer to you than breathing, and you can turn within at any time for enlightenment on any subject, whether it's building a bridge, building a house, or building a painting. Now, a question. A few people without any preparation seem to have found a shortcut to a God experience. Well, that is absolutely true. But don't judge by appearances, because you don't know the preparations of their past lives. Never believe for a moment that our lives began in 1800 and something or 1900 and something, because that would be folly. We have lived as long as God. We have coexisted with God from the beginning of whatever God is. Our individual life began the same time that 2 times 2 became 4. And we have lived as conscious identity, sometimes on earth and sometimes not on earth. Makes no difference where we live or where we have lived. Where we are living is determined by our former experiences. Just as you go through daily experiences that carry you through them safely, securely, peacefully, and your neighbor doesn't. 1,000 falls at your left and 10,000 at your right. It does not come nigh your dwelling place. And it's no accident at all. If you have been living to any extent at all on the spiritual path, not 1/10 of the things that can happen to you, that happen to the world, can happen to you. If you are on the spiritual path, you are right now avoiding 80 to 90% of the world's evils. We are not yet at a state of consciousness where we can live above all of them, but we are living 50%, 60%, 70%, 80% more free of the world's tribulations than the world is. And that is determined by your degree of spiritual evolution or illumination. Some time ago, that statement was questioned. And my answer was, go to the authorities and find out how many Christian Science alcoholics there are in the world. Find out how many Christian Science drug addicts there are in the world. Try to find out how many Christian Science gamblers there are in the world. And I don't have to tell you that the answer is you can't find any. So in that degree then, if that were the only degree, right there is one church that has made itself free of those three evils. You can go further than that and find that they are avoiding and have avoided 50, 60, 70, 80% of the world's diseases. I mean, those are a matter of records. So, with what measure of light they have, they are already demonstrating their greater freedom from the evils that are befalling their neighbors. And so we are finding in our work, when students come to the Infinite Way, the first year, the second year, the third year, there's hardly a month when they aren't asking for help for some problem or other. And then it begins to fade away. And the first thing you know, you are finding years and years go by, either without asking for help or with having problems quickly met. And so in the degree of your spiritual illumination, in the degree of your realization of the name and nature of God, in that degree are you free of the world's problems. Less accidents will come nigh your dwelling place. Less poverty, less disease, less sin. Oh, remember this. It doesn't mean that you're going to immediately carry your whole family with you, because salvation is individual. And while you can be some measure of help to your family, for the fullness and completeness, they have to arrive at it through their own consciousness. That is why the Master said that you sometimes have to leave your mother and father and sister and brother. He didn't mean desert them, but you have to leave them to their own way of life while you go on living your way of life. And if their way of life continues them in sin or disease or lack, all you can do is stand by with the greatest degree of realization you have to help them. The spiritually illumined live by grace. Thank you